Welcome back, friends, to the steps on how to buy a home, become a homeowner. This is step 2. If you watched the first video, you learned that our first step is to meet together, to have a consultation, and for us to decide if we're a good fit to work together. We've made that decision and you've decided to hire us as your agency. So now we're on to step number 2. That's all about money. So we're going to talk about what does your realistic budget look like. We're going to make sure that you've gotten a lender and you've gotten through that full process. And then we're going to move on to what is the range of properties in which we can look at. So let's talk about those 3 items. One, what does your realistic budget look like? Even if you've been pre-approved, what the bank will lend to you is not necessarily what you want to spend. And we've got to have very real conversations around money and what you want your payment to look like every single month. Now, along with that, we've got to talk about your reserve balances. And this is where a lot of people kind of feel like we're being a little bit intrusive. It's not that at all, but you've got to be 100% upfront with us so that we can make sure that we help you, again, reach those desired outcomes. When we find your perfect house, you'll be ready to jump and make it your own. So what kind of reserves do you have on hand? Do you have money for a down payment? And if not, what's our solution to that problem? There are down payment assistance programs. We need to talk to you about those qualifications and get you to the right people to help determine if you're a fit and a candidate for those programs. Are you ready to pay your closing costs? Do you have enough money in reserves to make both your down payment and your closing costs? Do you need the seller to pay your closing costs? We've got to have that conversation because it goes into our negotiation abilities. So if I know up front that I have to negotiate for the seller to pay all of your closing costs, I've got to be able to present to the seller your very best offer with that being included. Sometimes that might mean that you're paying over the list price because you've got to have that seller to pay your closing costs. Do you have just money sitting in reserve to be able to move? Moving is expensive. And if you are a first-time homeowner, then you've got to pay things like deposits on utilities. You've got to pay a mover. You don't know necessarily what those expenses are. And it's important that we review them with you on the front end to avoid unexpected expenses on the back end. So once we've had that discussion and we've had a conversation about how much money you've got in the bank or how much Aunt Glenda is going to give you for the down payment, then we're ready to move on to the next step in the process, which is the pre-approval process. So we're going to have a conversation about lenders that you may know. We're going to ask you, do you have an affiliation or do you have a relationship with a bank or a mortgage loan officer? And if you do, that's great. 100%, we want to help you through that process and work together with that lender. So we're going to ask you for their name and their contact information. We're going to kind of be building this team as we go through the process, and they're the very next one that we're going to draft onto our home buying team. If you don't know any lenders, especially if it's your first home purchase, then we're going to suggest some to you. We're going to give you some lenders that we've had positive experiences with, that our clients have loved, that we know will get us to the closing table. Now, we're never going to talk negatively about other lenders, but we are going to tell you these are the ones that have never missed a closing date. These are the ones that have been able to get our clients into those down payment assistance programs with success and have made it to the closing table. Getting from that pre-approval to close is of the utmost importance. You don't want things to fall apart midway through. So we're in step number 2 and we still haven't gone out and looked at a house yet. We're not going to do that until we've gone through the full pre-approval process. There's a big difference between a pre-qualification and a pre-approval. We want you to go through the full pre-approval process. We want you to know that you are going to be able to gain this funding before we get to the closing table. No surprises, no hiccups. The worst thing that can happen is you come in with a pre-qualification. We find your dream house. 123 Brown Street is it. It's the one you want. It's where you want to begin your home ownership journey. And guess what? 3 weeks into the process, we find out there's some outlier that's not going to allow you to be approved for that loan. And you are beyond disappointed. Well, we're going to avoid that on the front end. So we're going to have you meet with your lender. That typically takes, again, 30 to 45 minutes. We want you to set up a time with them to meet via either in person or via Zoom to provide them with all the documents that they're going to need in order to get you pre-approved. So you've got some homework here too. In the last episode, you saw that you had some homework to really think about what you wanted in a house. Now you've got some homework to go gather some documents. So you're going to need some tax returns, usually the last 2 years. You're going to need some pay stubs, typically the last 2. You're going to need some bank statements, again, typically the last 2. Do you see the commonality here? The last 2 of pretty much everything. You're going to need to go ahead and gather all of that information prior to your meeting with this lender. It just will make the meeting go much smoother when you have all of that documentation. They're going to ask you some different questions. They're going to ask you about your income. They're going to ask you about, are you an hourly employee? Are you salaried? They're going to ask you about bonus structures. They're going to ask you about overtime. They're going to ask you about money that you have in reserves. And they're going to ask you about debt. So once all of that has been completed and they're able to really see the true whole perspective of your financial situation, then they'll move through to what's called underwriting, and they'll get an initial underwriter to review your file and issue that pre-approval letter. So once that's happened, then we're ready to come back and have another conversation. Well, the bank says I can spend X amount of dollars. Great. Let's see if that X amount of dollars matches the homework that you did in episode 1. Hopefully they're a good match. If not, we're going to have some real conversations. This is what you can afford. This was what was on your list. And let's try to find the best match or the best mesh of those together, if you will. Once we've got all of that in play, we know what you prefer your down payment to be and your monthly payment. We know what the bank will allow you to spend. We know whether you have cash on hand for your down payment or if you need down payment assistance. And we know whether you have the cash on hand to pay for your closing costs. Then we're ready to get started. So next step will be actually going to look at properties. So stay tuned for the next episode where we'll talk about when to tour and make an offer.